There is a quiet, hidden lake a short walk from my house in East Texas. I've been going there to fish for a long time. It is tucked away from the roads and houses, which gives it perfect privacy. Usually, I am the only person out there on the water. Because the walk is a bit long, I leave my canoe in the same spot by the lake whenever I am not using it. It is much easier than carrying the heavy thing back and forth from the house. I keep it leaning against a large oak tree and keep it covered so that snakes or other animals do not hide inside. One warm summer evening, I was out on the water with my younger brother, MJ. He is only in the 4th grade, and since our parents were out for the evening, I was responsible for watching him. We had been out for about an hour and had caught a few catfish. As the sun began to set and the light disappeared behind the pine trees, I heard a loud splashing sound from the edge of the lake. I turned the boat and saw a man standing at the water's edge. He was tipping a large barrel over and pouring a dark liquid into the lake. It looked like he was polluting the water. I felt I had to do something, so I shouted out to ask him what he was doing. The man looked up at me in surprise and immediately ran into the woods, even though the barrel was still pouring. I looked closer at the liquid and noticed it was a very dark red color. Even though it was getting dark, the sight made me feel very uneasy. I decided we needed to leave right away. I care a lot about nature, and seeing someone dump waste like that made me sick, but I no longer felt safe at the lake. I planned on reporting the man to the authorities. I paddled back to our usual spot and unloaded our gear. As I was covering the canoe, I heard the distinct sound of a branch snapping nearby. I wanted to call out, but I decided it was better to stay quiet. I finished my work faster than ever before. I did not even bother to lean the canoe against the tree. I just left it on the grass. I grabbed our cooler and gear and MJ and I walked quickly. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire time because I felt like someone was following us through the trees. Once we got home, I locked the door immediately. I was truly spooked. I put the fish in the fridge and started heating up some food for my brother. While the microwave was running, there was a sudden knock at the front door. The fear I felt in the woods came back instantly. I was certain I had been followed. My lights were on and my car was in the driveway, so whoever was outside knew we were home. A moment later, the person moved and knocked on the window. A man's voice came through the glass, telling me that he had seen me at the lake and wanted to explain himself. I had no intention of opening the door. The fact that he had tracked me to my house made him seem very dangerous. When he became more aggressive and kept yelling for me to answer, I finally shouted through the wall. I told him to leave immediately or I would call the police. The man tried to remain calm and asked me again to just open the front door so he could talk. I repeated my threat to call the cops, and then the house went silent. I went around and locked every single window. I called the police to report the dumping at the lake and the man at my door. Making those reports helped me feel a little better, but I remained very alert. Around 2 a.m., a loud crash from the den woke me up. I realized someone had broken in. I grabbed a heavy baseball bat and told MJ to stay hidden. I heard quiet footsteps coming up the stairs. I stood by the bedroom door with the bat ready. I watched the doorknob slowly turn and the door push open. The silhouette of a man entered the room. I quickly turned on the lamp and yelled for him to get out. I showed him I was armed and ready to defend us. The man had a small blade in his hand, but when he saw I wasn't backing down, he told me he was leaving. He turned and ran back downstairs. I chased him as far as the landing and watched him flee through the front door. I checked on MJ and then called the emergency line. My living room window was completely shattered with glass all over the carpet. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, holding my bat and watching that broken window. At 7 a.m., my parents finally returned home. I explained everything that had happened while they were away. My father went straight to work. He measured the frame and fixed the window. I later went back to the lake with the police to show them where the man had been. However, the barrel was gone. The man must have come back to move it before morning. I believe that barrel held something much worse than chemicals. I think it was something he was willing to kill for. I am just glad I kept the door locked and my brother safe. A week later, I still felt uneasy, so I went back to the oak tree to get my canoe. The grass underneath it was flat and dying. When I flipped the boat over, I froze in fear. Someone had carved a message into the wood with a knife. "I know where you sleep." Next to the words was a rusty fishing lure I had never seen before. That's when it hit me. He hadn't just followed me once. He was still out there watching and waiting for me to be alone in the woods again.
The separation of my parents occurred before I was born, which meant my childhood was split between two different homes. Every summer until I reached 19, I traveled to rural Missouri to stay with my father. He had been raised in that same countryside, and the majority of his relatives still lived in the small community. Since there were no movie theaters or typical city entertainment, I spent most of those long, humid days following my older cousin around. We were constantly looking for ways to get into mischief or exploring the dense woods that surrounded my father's property. During one of our usual treks through the wilderness, we stumbled upon a massive lake hidden deep in the middle of nowhere. It sat there quietly, undisturbed by the outside world. The water was remarkably clear, and as we looked closer, we could see an incredible number of huge fish swimming just beneath the surface. When we returned home and asked the adults about the spot, none of them seemed to know it existed. We figured that was why the fish had grown to such monstrous sizes. No one in the area was fishing there. Anyone who had found it in the past must have kept the location a secret or simply forgotten it. We returned to that hidden pond 3 or 4 times after that, and every single trip resulted in a stringer heavy with large fish. On our 5th visit, we had a specific goal in mind. The summer was drawing to a close, and we wanted to gather enough fish for a large family fry to celebrate the end of the season. We set out on a warm Saturday morning, leaving about an hour before the sun came up. The hike into the woods took over an hour, and we knew the fish would stop biting once the afternoon heat set in. Our plan was to finish early and make it back to my father's house by the start of the afternoon. The sight of the pond at dawn was beautiful. As soon as we cast our lines, the fish started biting almost immediately. For the next few hours, it was constant action, with one fish after another being pulled from the clear water. By late morning, around 10:45, we had reached our limit. I was anxious to start the long walk back. We were carrying 2 5-gallon buckets filled to the brim with our catch, and I knew the 90-minute trek would be even slower with the extra weight. However, my cousin had other ideas. He decided he wanted to take a swim in the lake before we left. He tried to convince me to jump in with him, but I didn't know how to swim at the time. Despite my desire to leave, he was older and in charge, so I had no choice but to wait. I sat down on a large rock and watched as he prepared for his swim. There was an old, weathered rope tied to a tree limb hanging over the water, looking as though it had been there for a century. My cousin decided he wanted to use it as a swing. I told him it looked dangerous and expressed my concerns, but he just laughed at me. He stripped down to his boxers, left his clothes in a pile next to me, and climbed up into the tree. After grabbing the rope, he pushed off and swung out over the lake. The rope snapped right above him before he reached the peak of his swing. He hit the deep water with a heavy, dull thud. At first, I prepared myself to laugh and tease him about the rope breaking, but as the seconds ticked by, he did not come back to the surface. The silence became terrifying. I scanned the water, hoping to see him pop up further away or perhaps floating if the impact had knocked him out, but there was nothing. Panic began to set in. I waded into the water as far as I felt safe, desperately searching the depths. However, every step I took stirred up the silt, making the water cloudy and impossible to see through. It eventually became clear that he had drowned. I felt completely helpless, wondering if I could have saved him if only I knew how to swim. With nothing else I could do, I packed up our gear and began the walk home alone. The walk back was agonizing. A tiny part of me hoped that this was all a cruel joke, and that he would jump out from behind a tree to surprise me. That moment never came. The weight of the news I had to deliver grew heavier with every step. When I finally reached my family, I tried to explain what happened, but the words kept getting stuck in my throat. Finally, I managed to tell them that Mark had drowned. Once I regained some composure, I led my father and uncle back through the woods to the pond. We searched the area, but there was still no sign of his body. We eventually had to go to the sheriff's office to report the incident officially. As we approached the station, I began to freak out. In my young mind, I was certain I would be blamed for the accident. The adults eventually calmed me down and assured me I wasn't in trouble, but the guilt remained. Every time I looked at my uncle, I felt responsible. Even though he told me he didn't blame me, I found it hard to believe he didn't hold some small resentment toward me for being the one who came home. I gave my statement to the sheriff. A formal search was scheduled for the following morning. As it turned out, that was the same day I was scheduled to return to my mother's house. On Monday night, my mother sat me down to give me an update. She told me that a team of divers had successfully recovered Mark's body earlier that day. They explained that one of his feet had become tangled in a sunken log, which was why he had been unable to resurface. Hearing the details didn't make the pain go away, but the tragedy changed the course of my life. The experience served as a powerful motivation for me to finally learn how to swim. The guilt of being unable to help stayed with me for decades, and I vowed never to be in a position where I was unable to assist someone in danger again. In a strange and painful way, his passing had a lasting impact on who I became, though I would still give anything to have him back with us today.
Growing up, the highlight of my life was the time spent fishing with my two older brothers. We lived in a remote rural area where the woods felt endless, and we would often spend our days hiking. Through the thick brush, we found various hidden creeks. Our success in terms of actual fish was usually minimal. The creeks rarely yielded anything of significant size. However, the catch was never the true point of the excursion. The real value lay in the silent camaraderie of sitting by the water with my brothers, passing the hours in the stillness of the trees. We followed the classic tradition of waking up long before the sun had risen. Our treks would begin in the cool, gray pre-dawn as we watched the light slowly steal across the sky and filter through the canopy. By the time we reached our chosen destination, the world would be fully bright. The morning dew would be clinging to our boots. It was a peaceful routine that defined our summers. The most frightening experience we ever had occurred on a day when we decided to be more adventurous than usual. We set out that morning with a collective determination to push further into the hills than we had ever gone before. We bypassed our familiar, reliable spots and kept walking until the woods grew denser and the air felt heavier. Eventually, we stumbled upon a location that seemed perfect. The surrounding forest was thick and ancient, but the creek itself was unexpectedly wide and deep. A large fallen tree stretched across the water like a natural bridge, adding to the beauty. After testing the trunk to ensure it was sturdy enough to hold our weight, the three of us carefully balanced our way across to the far bank. We spread out our gear and began to fish, hopeful for better luck. As the afternoon wore on, however, the fish remained elusive. The heat of the day began to set in, and the repetitive casting of lines grew tedious. Given how deep and inviting the water looked, we broke our usual rules. We set our fishing poles aside on the bank and jumped into the creek to go swimming. We had been splashing around for quite a while when I noticed a sudden shift in the atmosphere. My middle brother had stopped moving entirely and was staring intently into the dark tree line. When our oldest brother asked what was bothering him, he simply gestured toward the shadows of the woods. He whispered that someone was out there watching us from the cover of the trees. My initial thought was that we had encountered some local creep, but as I followed his pointing finger, that suspicion turned into sharp fear. Standing among the trees was an imposing large man. Despite the shade, we could make out his appearance quite clearly. He was dressed in jeans and a heavy flannel shirt, which seemed strangely out of place given the warmth. A baseball cap was pulled low over his brow, obscuring much of his face. The most terrifying detail, however, was the long firearm, either a rifle or a shotgun, that he held firmly in his hands. A heavy silence fell over us as we tried to decide what to do. We were well aware that by wandering this far, we were almost certainly trespassing. We never knew exactly where the property lines were. We knew this land didn't belong to us. Up until that moment, we had never faced any consequences for our wandering. My middle brother and I looked to our oldest brother for a plan, but he looked shaken. He offered no immediate direction, choosing instead to keep his eyes locked on the armed man. Eventually, our oldest brother suggested that we should try to navigate back to the bank, grab our gear and retreat. The problem was that our clothes and poles were on the same side of the creek where the man was standing. We began to move slowly through the water toward the shore, trying to remain calm, before we could reach the bank. However, an elderly woman suddenly burst from the undergrowth. She was shrieking with a high, piercing intensity that sounded like a banshee. The sudden noise startled me so badly that I slipped. I fell backward into the deep water, struggling until my middle brother grabbed my arm and pulled me back to the surface. The woman was disheveled and frantic as she ran straight for our pile of belongings. She began grabbing our fishing poles and clothes, clutching them to her chest while shouting that everything now belonged to her. She gathered the items in a desperate heap, dropping small pieces of gear as she managed the armful. Our oldest brother shouted for her to stop and tried to move faster toward the shore to reclaim our property. However, our middle brother reached out and stopped him, pointing back toward the large man in the flannel shirt. The man had moved closer to the water's edge as we approached the shore. He raised his gun and leveled it in our direction as he walked. I remember yelling out in terror while my middle brother apologized. He told them we were sorry for trespassing on their land. The pair ignored our pleas entirely. Our oldest brother, driven by a mix of frustration and bravado, muttered that he didn't think the man would actually shoot. He tried to take another step toward the woman to get our shoes and shirts back. The moment he moved, the woman's demeanor shifted from frantic to aggressive. She pulled a fillet knife from her pocket. She began waving it wildly at him, screaming that she would cut him if he came any closer. By this point, the large man had reached the very edge of the creek. He cocked the shotgun with a heavy mechanical click and pointed it directly at my oldest brother's chest. That sound was enough to make him freeze instantly in his tracks. It was a terrifying, tense standoff. We stood chest deep in the cold water, shivering as we stared down the barrel of a gun. Once the woman had finished scavenging every bit of our gear and clothing, the man spoke a single, gravelly word. He told us to get out. We didn't wait for a second invitation. All three of us turned and swam desperately for the opposite bank. We scrambled out of the water and began running into the woods. The journey home was miserable. We had to hike several miles through the dense forest wearing nothing but our soaking wet shorts. We were completely barefoot, and every twig, sharp rock, and dried leaf stung our feet. Despite the pain, we were far too frightened to even think about looking back or slowing down. When we finally made it home and explained why we had returned empty-handed, our father surprisingly didn't scold us. He simply told us that there are dangerous, unstable people living deep in the woods, and that we had to be more careful. It was a very long time before any of us felt brave again.
Back when I was a teenager, me and my brother were absolutely obsessed with fishing. We still enjoy the occasional trip all these years later. Don't get me wrong, but back then we lived and breathed river fishing. So much so that we used to participate in fishing tournaments and therefore had to take part in training sessions every other day. Spoilers, but these training sessions were just an excuse to get some time in by the river. and I won't bore you with how the fishing tournaments work. So just take our word that we fished an awful lot. Anyway, I was like 13 years old. It was September, and me and my brother were fishing down at this river bend out in the sticks. Now, you gotta keep in mind that in river and lake fishing, you gotta be quiet as a mouse unless you scare the fish away. So as the skies darkened, this low rumbling of thunder echoed around the sky. Well, you can imagine how creepy that was. We're expecting rain, but that doesn't mean we're going to stop fishing. And it has to take much more than that to scare us off. And cue the appearance of some creepy stranger who walks out of the woods on the other side of the river. He doesn't have any gear with him besides the rod, but he's got a fishing hat on one that has all his scraggly gray hair tumbling out from under it. We try to wave hi, but he just gives us this look as if to say, "You're in my spot." And me and my brother are getting ready to pack up if he asks us, because God knows people can get really territorial about their favorite spot being crept on. But the guy doesn't say anything, and he just walks about 100 yards upstream and starts fishing up there. All right, he was kind of choking off our spot. But we were never ones to back away from a challenge, so we stayed put. As we're fishing, the thunder and lightning get louder and louder, and the gaps between them shorter and shorter, meaning it's slowly traveling right above our heads. I end up looking upstream to see if the grumpy old dude is still there, and he is. But then I notice how his rod is bending and doesn't sit right with me. It looks nice and strong, but way too flexible to be anything other than carbon fiber. At least, that was my guess. But here's the thing. Although you don't think of carbon fiber as being metal, it's super conductive to electricity. Meaning, if this guy really was using a carbon fiber rod, it wasn't so much a fishing rod as a lightning rod. I remember whispering to my brother, like, "Think that guy's using carbon fiber?" To which he replies, "He's old. Is that Tom?" "Look at the way the thing's been, though," I remember saying. My brother looks again, and that's when he sees what I'm seeing. And then out of nowhere, this huge crack and flash let us know that we've just been within 100 yards of a lightning strike that impacted really close to our grumpy fishing guy. We get up and just hightail it over to where he was standing, and there's this guy's rod laying there in the dirt smoking. We started looking around for the guy to see if he was okay, but we couldn't find anything. Not a single trace of this dude. But then my brother finds one of the guy's boots lying near the root of the tree that's smoking too. And that's when he looks up. We finally find where the guy went. The lightning had blown this poor sob right up into a tree. We bailed to the nearest gas station to call the EMTs, but by that time, the guy was long dead. There was no saving him. This was a long time ago, and a memory that stuck with me for a long time, and it was truly very hard to get back into fishing after that. But of all the freaky occurrences that kind of came out of that, the one thing that really stuck with me was the smell in the air when we finally found him. It honestly smelled like barbecue pork. About 8 years ago now, me and my dad and a few of my cousins were fishing down in southern Maryland one summer. We were out at the particular spot where there are these things called target ships. These are old decommissioned Navy ships that have been mounted on top of concrete pillars so they can float no matter how much the Navy tests munitions on them. They get shot at by all kinds of vehicles with all kinds of bullets, bombs, and missiles. But anyway, we're all on my dad's Grady White fishing for croaker and flounder right near these target ships. If they're actually being used for military exercises, you can't even get near them. So since there's no one out there to wave us away, we were out near the target ships with about 20 other boats in the water. But then, sure enough, About an hour, and some guy from the Coast Guard sails up to us. They're on a big old CG boat with about 15 trainees on board, and the officer in command asks a favor from my dad. He wants to know if he can practice a little inspection drill with a few of his trainees. Being the good guy he is, my dad gives them permission, then renders them coming on board. I feel my rod getting all heavy all of a sudden. I call it out, and the Coast Guard officer stops his inspection and says, "Go ahead, son, reel it up. Let's see what you got." So I reel and reel, and it's really obvious how heavy whatever I've caught is. So naturally, we're all getting mad excited. Then, to all of our absolute horror, I pull the thing from the water, and we all see that it is an unexploded bomb. It was a cylindrical diamond shape with neon green stabilizers, about 12 to 14 inches long and 4 inches in diameter at its thickest part. Well, now the officer, the trainee, and the entire boat of Coast Guard has just witnessed what I pulled out of the water. And I'm not kidding when I say that. I watched the color drain from all their faces. They went from pink, unhealthy, to skeletal white. And the time it took to say the trainee on our boat literally leaves to his boat, and they all haul it away with their sirens on. This leaves a very rattled Coast Guard officer on our boat, who promptly orders me to not move a single muscle. The Coast Guard gets on our VHF and tells all the boats in the area to leave the target ships. And I'm telling you, you ain't never seen fishing boats move so fast. After about 20 minutes of me sitting there with this bomb on my line, the area is finally cleared away. The officer orders my father to put his boat and drive to achieve a good bit of speed, and then don't stop. So my dad goes as he's ordered, puts the boat in gear, and seconds, we're rolling about 50 to 20 knots away from the ship. The absurd brings out a knife, cuts my line, and orders my dad to just throttle the boat and get away as fast as you can. Needless to say, it did not detonate when it hit the bottom of the bay. We took the officer, who was pretty clearly shaken, back to his ship. I know it's hard to believe the story without proof, but in the situation, we didn't have time to get a picture of it. We tried, but the Coast Guard officer was adamant about us getting out of there as quickly as possible. But take my word for it, it's easily the scariest thing I've ever had happen to me during a fishing trip.
My friend from work, Samuel, called me during what was an otherwise quiet evening. His voice was full of excitement for the upcoming summer holiday, and he proposed we go on a hiking trip. He spoke as if it were the most wonderful idea in the world. A cold feeling immediately settled in my stomach. I cut him short, perhaps a bit too abruptly, and explained that I was not a fan of hiking. We spoke for a few moments more before I found an excuse to end the call. The reason I have this aversion isn't a simple dislike for walking in nature. It stems from a deeply traumatic experience in my past that I have never been able to forget. It all happened during the long summer vacation of my sophomore year in college. We were young, filled with the kind of reckless confidence that only youth can provide. At the beginning of that year, my best friends, Mike, Peter, and I, had made a pact. We pledged to seek out new experiences, to do things we had never done before, to push our boundaries. So when the idea of a hiking trip through Death Valley in Eastern California was suggested, it sounded like the perfect adventure. We saw the ominous name not as a warning, but as a thrilling challenge. Our preparations were laughably inadequate. None of us had ever been on a real hike before, but in our arrogance, we didn't think to do any research. We figured it would be like a slightly more rugged camping trip. We threw some snacks, a few bottles of water, and a paper map into our bags, convinced we were ready for anything. The three of us gathered with a sense of boundless optimism outside the college park, piling into Mike's old, slightly unreliable car. The initial hours of the drive were filled with laughter and loud music. With me navigating from the passenger seat, we pushed deeper into the wilderness. After a few hours, the map seemed to indicate that we had reached our destination. Yet the scenery was a vast, empty expanse. There were no signs, no visitor center, nothing to confirm we were in the right place. We decided to drive just a little further, hoping to spot a landmark or another person. That was when the engine sputtered, coughed, and died. The silence that followed was deafening. We got out and popped the hood, staring at the complex machinery with no real understanding. We tinkered with it for over an hour, our frustration mounting with each failed attempt to start the car. Finally, we surrendered. With a shrug of false confidence, we decided to leave it and walk forward. It seemed like a simple choice at the time. We grabbed our bags and started our trek into the desert. We walked for what felt like an eternity, but was likely more than 2 hours. The sun was a relentless force, beating down on us with an intensity I had never imagined possible. The air was so hot it felt like we were breathing in a furnace. My throat was painfully dry, so I pulled out my water bottle and drank deeply, finishing almost half of it in one go. We paused for a 20-minute rest under the pathetic shade of a small rock outcropping before pushing onward. It was then that we checked our phones, but there was no reception. My screen showed nothing but an empty signal bar. Mike's and Peter's were the same. A knot of genuine annoyance and fear began to tighten in my stomach. My frustration boiled over, and I shouted out, questioning whose brilliant idea it was to attempt this hike without a guide. Both Mike and I instinctively turned to look at Peter. He held his hands up defensively, his voice nervous as he insisted it had only been a suggestion and that we were the ones who had taken it so seriously. A tense silence fell over our small group. I took a deep, shaky sigh and continued walking, my heart heavy with a growing sense of dread. The thirst soon became overwhelming again, and I drank the rest of my water, trying to save a few last sips that barely coated my tongue. Hours crawled by, but the landscape never changed. It was an endless panorama of sand and rock, offering no landmarks and no signs of life. We were wandering aimlessly, following instincts that were proving to be utterly useless. Suddenly, Mike stopped dead in his tracks. He crouched down, his head in his hands, declaring that he couldn't walk another step, and that this entire trip was a horrible mistake. I had to agree. I was exhausted too, so I suggested we stop to eat the cookies I brought, hoping the small amount of sugar would give us some energy. As we ate, Peter voiced the question that was on all of our minds. He wondered if we could just go back, admitting he had no idea if we were even heading in the right direction. A sliver of hope sparked within us at the thought of retreat. We all turned to look back the way we came, desperate to see our path. But there was nothing. The wind had completely erased our footprints, leaving only the pristine, unforgiving desert. The sight was more terrifying than the heat or the thirst. It was as if the desert had swallowed our past, leaving us utterly and completely lost. After finishing our meager food, we decided our only option was to wait for someone to find us. But as the hours passed, the emptiness remained unbroken. A strange, unnerving feeling began to creep in. Peter was the first to point it out, his finger aimed at the sun. He noted how the day seemed to be dragging on for far too long. He was right. By our estimation, we had been stranded for over 10 hours, yet the sun hung in the sky as if it were still high noon, refusing to set. It felt unnatural, as if time itself was broken. We checked our phones again, but the batteries had all died, leaving us cut off and without even the comfort of knowing the time. We knew waiting was a death sentence. We forced our protesting bodies to stand and began walking once more, into the vast unknown. My thirst was a physical pain now. I reached for my bottle out of habit, knowing it was empty. I asked Mike and Peter if they had any water left, but they shook their heads. The reality of our situation crashed down on me. We were dehydrated and lost in one of the hottest places on earth. My head began to spin, and my vision blurred at the edges. I could no longer feel my legs, and my body felt disconnected from my mind. I was losing consciousness just before the world went black. I saw a dark wall on the horizon, a massive dust storm rolling towards us like an angry wave. My first sensation upon waking was the sterile smell of antiseptic and the soft feeling of clean sheets. I was in a hospital emergency room. I looked around the quiet room, but I was alone. When an attendant came in, I asked him how I had arrived there. He explained that park rangers had found me alone, unconscious, and almost completely buried in sand. According to their timeline, I had been unconscious for 2 full days. My voice cracked as I asked about Mike and Peter. The attendant's expression turned to one of confusion. He told me the rangers had found no one else. Later that evening, the rangers themselves came to my room. I told them everything. The car breaking down, the map. Getting lost, my friends who were with me. They listened patiently, but reiterated that I was the only person they found at the site. My pleas grew desperate, and I begged them to look again. Seeing my distress, they finally assured me they would conduct a wider search of the area. I spent the next week in that hospital bed, clinging to the hope that Mike and Peter would be found and brought to the room next door. On the day I was scheduled for discharge, the rangers returned one last time. Their faces were grim. They informed me that they had found nothing. There was no sign of Mike, no sign of Peter, and no trace of the car. They theorized that my friends had likely been buried completely during the severe sandstorm. To this very day, no sign of Mike or Peter has ever been found. They vanished into the desert. That experience left a scar on my soul, and now I avoid any kind of trip that takes me away from the safety of civilization. Hiking, camping, it doesn't matter. The fear is always there.